Ads ruining your favourite cycling podcast? Sick of shallow bike reviews? Escape Collective is different. We deliver the content you crave without the distractions. We're member supported, and that means ad-free podcasts, independent and honest reporting, and real conversations within a passionate community. It's a better way to experience cycling media. Join us at escapecollective.com/join.
So what changed over the last 10 years? We have looked at comfort as the main driver 10 years ago. Comfort is directly related to maximum pressure. Then we have tried to get rid of these maximum pressure points. The learning curve, there are way more possibilities to optimize a position than just maximum pressure. Think about a bike fit as a process rather than one event that never comes back.
Knee over pedal spin, as it was called. Is that still relevant?
12 o'clock is way more important than 3 o'clock when I want to evaluate crank lengths. And that range between 160 to 170 is more and more important for the future.
Are there any sort of acid tests you can do for whether or not the front end is in a good place or not? Welcome back to Performance Process. My name is Ronan McLaughlin, Senior Tech Editor with Escape Collective and your host for this podcast. In this week's episode, I sat down for a conversation with sports scientist and CEO of Gebiomized, Daniel Schade, about modern bike fitting and navigating the pros and cons of current bike fitting trends. We discussed stability and aerodynamics and how saddle position, crank length, foot angle, and the front end all feed into the optimal position and how that optimal varies from rider to rider. I hope you enjoy the conversation. Feel free to join that conversation with other members following this week's show on the Performance Process channel of Escape Collective's Discord, where you can also reach me with any feedback or episode requests that you may have. Finally, just a quick reminder, if you're not already a member, this podcast is recorded for Escape Collective members. Non-members can enjoy a sample of it, roughly about half the conversation. So if you want to hear the entire conversation, head over to escapecollective.com/join to become a member today. It's our members' subscriptions that make this show and everything we do at Escape Collective possible. So sign up today to access the full episodes of this podcast, all our tech news and reviews that you can trust, all our written and recorded content, and of course our member-only Discord, where you can find that Performance Process dedicated channel, along with an aero and time trial channel and a host of others exclusively for our members. So without further delay, let's hop into this week's episode. Daniel, it was Dan Bigham who recommended yourself for this podcast. I had asked him who could I speak to on modern bike fitting. He recommended you. I spoke to you last week, sort of planning this episode, and you had said that you work with Ineos Grenadiers in a sort of balancing act. So while Dan is aero at all costs and trying to improve the aerodynamics as far as possible, and then train the rider to sustain that, you're stepping in there with a voice of reason and saying perhaps this might not work. Is that fair? Is that accurate?
Yeah, hello from my side, Daniel here. I think it's fair to say it this way. So I'm working with Ineos Grenadiers for quite some time. I already started when they were still Team Sky, and my role as a bike fitter was always balancing weight distribution and balancing the rider on the bike in the best possible way, in the best individual possible way. I think that's important because it's not the same position for every rider. And when Dan came into the team, of course, he brought a large ton of expertise in terms of aerodynamics. And when you know Dan, you know that he wants to always find this little extra nugget, one extra mile, one step further. And I think that's super cool, and that's a nice approach also to bring the team forward. But at some point, you also have to balance different factors. And when aerodynamics is one factor for me, but we also have the biomechanical side. So stability, comfort, weight distribution. So this balancing act. And I see myself or my role as, try to balance these, get the information from the aerodynamic side, but also add my stability side. And sometimes we come up in a project with one rider to say, hey, this looks like it's the fastest and maybe the best aerodynamic position, but just with a small percent. But when we look into the negative side, maybe we lose a lot of stability aspects or a lot of comfort, and we don't trust this position can be held for a long time, can be sustainable. And then we decide, hey, let's go to the second best, because the second best aerodynamic position might be the best package, the best balance for this rider. And that's how we're working.
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if I'm paraphrasing Dan or what, but I seem to remember him saying somewhere that his sort of approach was physiology is very difficult to train and is a long process. Whereas in aerodynamics, you can, if we talk about, overall speed, you can get speed quicker from improving your aerodynamics. And so his focus has always been, for himself at least, I think, to optimize the aerodynamics as far as possible and then train the body to sustain that. That seems to be the modern way for bike fitting, in that previously it was, right, how long are your legs, how long are your arms, and that dictated where your saddle would be and your handlebars would be, and you've got knee over pedal and all these other ways of bike fitting before. But aerodynamics wasn't something that was considered. Is that now as key to bike fitting as just where your saddle is, or how tight your hamstrings are, or something else?
Yeah, before we dig deeper into modern bike fitting, just maybe one last word about Dan and me to avoid irritation here. So we're not far away in our philosophy. So we're aligned and we think in the same way, and we just add more information and we add more expertise from different fields to make a wiser decision. And you don't have to think we're standing there in a velodrome debating all the day and we're completely confronted.
It's more fun to think the gap.
Yeah, so we're definitely, in a lot of times we're aligned, and he likes to get my input because it's just a different view on the same question, and I also like his input because that's really helpful. And at the end, the balance is we are often thinking about the same, that this is the right way to go. And when you I'm totally with him that aerodynamics is something that you have some gains that you can get quicker. But on the other hand, also that training aspect for me is super important. When I think about the normal rider, not maybe not a professional triathlete, it can be a long process to really create a posture that you can hold for a long time, that you really feel comfortable and strong in your aerodynamic position. So I would also take this training and posture coaching and development of an aero position as a process that might take time.
Going back to how bike fit traditionally has worked, like I think the sort of thing that I had in mind was that you get what you're given, in that if you've got a certain flexibility or if you've got a certain limb length or whatever it might be, you get a bike fit that matches that. Are we now moving to a place where actually you can just choose what direction you want to go with your bike fit, and the fixed sort of things like limb length and that aren't all that? And the reason I guess we're having this conversation is just following off the back of a episode we had, I think 2 episodes ago. We were looking at the progressive saddle positions and how a more forward and nose down position can help you with getting a bit more anterior pelvic rotation, and how that can help a rider just be more comfortable and be faster. But it's not something I would have previously considered, because I would have thought, well, my knee has to be in such and such a place in space, and my knee extension has to be at such a range. Is that changing?
Yeah, there are large differences when you compare bike fitting 10 or 20 years ago to modern bike fitting. So in the past, it was mainly about the anatomy. So there were some measurements about different bony lengths, like what's your inseam length, what's your overall body height, what's your arm length, and whatever. And then at some point, after making all these static measurements, there was like a formula where you input all these numbers, and then you get an idea about a position, so measured or better calculated by a computer. I think that's the way that static bike fitting worked in the past. And what has evolved is that you really look at the position in a dynamic view. So you analyze riders in their current position, and you analyze from all different angles. So you've got a 360-degree perspective. You can look at the contact points via pressure mapping, for example. You can understand power transfer, left to right pedal. You can look at compensation movement, what the body is doing when you pushes the body in a specific pattern, like increasing load or going into a more aerodynamic position or whatever. And you can look at all these different dynamic parameters. And I think that's the big difference to previous bike fittings. When you look at riders, how they really ride their bike and how they try to push the bike, how they try to realistically do the sports, you get better ideas why this or that might be wrong. And if you have a better idea, for example, why this rider has low back pain, it's because there is an hyperextension in the lumbar spine when he tries to go into the drops position, for example. That's an observation that you can match with the subjective feedback of the rider, and matching that is, for me as a bike fitter, super helpful to get an idea. Okay, what's my plan of actions now? What's in my toolbox now to reduce that low back pain? And because we can identify a lot of these discomfort issues on the bike, we're also able to go in different directions. So every bike fit nowadays can be way more individual and personal than it was in the past. If somebody tells me, I just want to be in your lab and see if we can gain a little bit more performance, maybe a little bit better symmetry on the pedal, maybe a little bit prolongated pushing phase, whatever, but no niggles, no issues. It's for me a different starting point than another rider coming in and saying, hey, I can be 30 minutes on the bike, but then the pain starts. Then I doesn't feel comfortable on the saddle. So complete different topic. My big stone with the second rider is how can I make him more comfortable on the bike that he just stays there for an hour, for 2, maybe for 4 hours before I look into the small performance gains, and complete 2 different directions for bike fitting.
You mentioned your lab there. You want to just talk us through, what it is you have there, and maybe even first it'd be useful for the listeners just to hear what Gebiomized is, because some will be familiar, some may not.
Yeah, so happy to do that. We're a cycling biomechanics brand. We have founded ourselves in 2003, so more than 20 years ago. And it all started with a patent on saddle pressure and making custom saddles. So that was our first contact to the cycling industry. So we had a request from a German sports specialist if we can build up a sensor mat that can detect the pressure distribution between saddle and human body. At that point of time, our mother company was involved in developing and producing pressure mapping systems for different applications. So we were able to say, yeah, let's do that. Why not? We make a sensor mat for a saddle. We made our first tests, a period of testing with the university in Münster, maybe about 4 years, 5 years, a lot of master teethers, a lot of testing and analyzing. And then we went into the market and presented that as a new bike fit approach to detect saddle pressure. To be honest, at that point of time, we were just ahead of the curve. So a lot of bike shop owners and people we have talked at Eurobike said, this is not important for me. I've sold saddles 100 years in a special way. I don't need technology for that. So I got that 2006, 2007 was just too early. But we have continued developing our own unique bike fit approach over the years. And in 2009, we've opened up our own first Gebiomized bike fitting lab. And the unique approach we're living in that lab is that we have a kinematic system on one hand. That's our video analysis from up to 4 perspectives. And we add that to a kinetic system, to our pressure mapping system at our contact point. And that's the unique approach. If you have the information of the contact point and you can match that with the typical kinematic information like a knee angle, a foot position, a knee over pedal spindle, a rotation of the hip, whatever, that's, I think, the big strength of the Gebiomized approach, that we really have information from 2 different worlds that we match together. And over the years, we have evolved. We have worked a lot in the professional field. We have helped, up to 10 pro teams, I would say, over the years to get their riders more stable and more comfortable and also more performance optimized on the bike. We have opened up some more Gebiomized concept labs in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, and we're growing. So we've done some product lines like our own saddle line, like our own inner sole line. So you can see maybe that every time when there's a contact point, so human body interacts with material, we act at that contact point and we use our information to make products that really help for this specific contact point, that this interaction just gets better, gets more stable, more comfortable, whatever.
And I've been to the lab in Germany. I've seen some of the pro jerseys hanging on the wall. You've worked with quite a few athletes down through the years. Some of the best.
Yeah, that's true. So we have won as bike fitters all the jerseys, all the big jerseys that you can imagine. So from Tour de France to Giro to Vuelta. And we've worked with different teams like Team Sky, Ineos Grenadiers. We've worked with Movistar, with Trek Segafredo for more than 5 years. We've worked with Mitchell & Scott when they were Mitchell & Scott, Orica, and all these years. So there are quite a few jerseys, and it's definitely one big element of our development, because working with these pro teams and also getting the questions from the pros really helped in our day-to-day process. And I would say that every client that comes into our lab nowadays really benefits from all the expertise we have created with the professional teams. So we try to transfer and duplicate the service we have done for the pro teams, that you can also get that just as a normal weekend warrior, because at the end it's the same process and these are similar questions we get. Of course, it might be a different threshold that you test, but at the end it's as important for the weekend warrior as for the professional cyclist that he is the best unit in terms of his body matched to his bike.
With that in mind, perhaps it's best we go back and start with that the rider who's looking for improved comfort. That might be it's certainly not going to be the most of the listeners we have here, because it's a performance process podcast. Everybody wants to hear about how we get faster, but it's certainly something that I think every listener and every rider has to tick off first, as you've said. So when someone comes into your studio, they're looking for a bike fit. It's 2024. They've got all the latest aero equipment and skin suits and everything else. Where are you starting first? When they get on the trainer in front of you, are you reverting back to the old knee angles and the measurements we spoke about earlier, and then moving forward from there? Or what's the process look like?
Yeah, we always start with a questionnaire. So the client starts to talk first and explain in his own words the reason why he has booked that bike fit. So we want to understand what are the niggles, what's the discomfort. And also, I always ask this question, what if you just can change one piece, what would be the ideal thing you would like to change? So that's my minimum requirement for that bike fitting. So he has got this one wish, and I want to understand what's this wish, because normally it also shows you a direction where you definitely have to go. And after really this first initial talk, where we exchange ideas and really get his subjective feedback, we do a round of flexibility tests because we want to understand the limitations of the body. That's a moment where we analyze that. So it doesn't mean that it stays like it is, but it gives me a first idea if there are some stronger asymmetries in the body, if there are some stronger limitations that I have to respect when I look to the position. And this is our pre-fit situation. We also look at the material. We look how the shoes look like, how the saddle look like. Do we see any signs of overuse or wear out or something like this? We look at cleat position, and then the rider jumps on the bike and we do a first baseline measurement without making any changes to the position. So we want to really see the pure element, because that's related to his discomfort he talked about before. If I would make any changes beforehand, I might ruin my whole analysis just because I have done some changes and it's not the same picture like he described for the last rides he has done. So, and the baseline mapping and I think that's one strength of Gebiomized, we try to create a protocol and a workflow that we get the most information that we need. If you work with a professional triathlete, it doesn't make sense to test with 100 watts only, because he's not riding 100 watts. If you test an e-bike rider in our lab, and you know that he normally just uses 100 watts because that's his mode that he's using, it doesn't make sense to say, but in the lab, we need 300 watts. So we try to create realistic protocols. We test all the hands position that are available and that be used. And we use our motion capture system plus our pressure mapping technology. Minimum is always saddle pressure, because that contact to the pelvis plays a big role and tells us a lot of information. But we often also add foot pressure, for example, to really detect how one leg is in contact to the pedal and how the other leg is in contact to the pedal as well. So we did this whole baseline analysis, and then there is the first round of analysis where the rider comes to me, we look together to the monitor and try to understand what do we see in the dynamic measurements. And I always try to create also this learning curve for our clients, that they get this understanding, hey, that's you on the bike, that's how you pedal, and do you see this kind of compensation or do you see this movement? And then I try to explain that. And when I feel, sometimes it takes longer, as you see now, that my explanation then goes a little bit too deep sometimes. But at that point, when I realize, okay, the client understands where are the reasons for the discomfort, then we create a plan of actions where we want to start. And it's often saddle height, saddle contact, and really try to optimize that discomfort on the saddle.
I think that will be a process that anybody who's been for a good bike fit will be familiar with, especially in over the last 10 years or so, as riders have become increasingly aware of how important bike fit is, and even the pressure mapping thing, because there are, well, I'm sure but to me it seems like countless bike fitters around the world who are using Gebiomized pressure sensor maps both in the saddle and in the insoles. And Chris McCann at Inspired Cycling here in Ireland was the first fella I seen using that, and that's at least 12 years ago at this point, I think, so maybe even 14 years ago.
One of the early adopters, big shout out.
That's well understood at this point. What I would like to know is, where does the process change now, or is there a change? And leaping forward to 2024, is there a different direction you go in after that initial process to the direction you would have went in 10 or 14 years ago?
So what changed over the last 10 years, we have looked at comfort as the main driver 10 years ago. So comfort is directly related to maximum pressure. So when we think about the saddle, for example, we have looked at these maximum pressure spots. So is it more on the front? Is it more on the back? Is it 700 millibar or is it 1200 millibar? And then we have tried to get rid of these maximum pressure points. And I think the learning curve for a lot of Gebiomized fitters over the years were, there are way more possibilities to optimize a position than just maximum pressure. So we have a small parameter called center of pressure. That's a parameter where you really see in a high sampling rate what the pelvis is doing. And in an ideal world, you see something like an infinity sign. And that would mean we have a symmetric movement of the pelvis in a natural way to the right side when the right side is going into the pushing phase, and then it swaps over to the left side, and then we have a shift of body weight to the left side when the left side goes into the pushing phase. So it would look ideally like this infinity sign. And if you very often you don't see this ideal picture. You see a picture like maybe one side has a circle and the other side has just a small dot, or it's a massive movement of the center of pressures. And we take a lot of this information by looking at the COP. And it's not just about the saddle contact. So for example, the COP as a parameter shows me when the crank is too long, which is something I haven't realized 10 years ago. Or when the cleat maybe gets a little bit too much space, when the cleat is wear out and you have a small kick of the knee to that side, at one point in the pushing phase, you can see it on the saddle because we have this interaction. What the foot is doing, the foot drives the knee drives the hip. And then the hip has to make this reaction movement, and we detect that reaction movement on the saddle. So these small details. Also, how long can you hold an aero position? What happens when your pelvis moves over the tip of the saddle? The COP moves over the tip of the saddle, and you have to reposition yourself backwards, which is negative in terms of your weight distribution and also in terms of your power transfer to go faster on the road. But this is something we don't detect with maximum pressure. We detect with this small element called COP. And this learning to get more out of the technology, this is, I think, a big learning over the last decade to really, it's the same technology, but just the parameter changed and the knowledge how to interpret the parameters. And I think that's one reason why it goes more and more into this performance aspect, because you can detect small things that are not right for the optimal power transfer by looking at a parameter that you have, I would say, a bit ignored 10 years ago.
Yeah, and you mentioned there a couple of times about the pelvis and the saddle position. That's one of that episode I did recently was just about moving the saddle further forward, moving it nose down. I found for me that eliminated the shuffling that you mentioned there, where you're like coming over the end of the saddle and then shuffling back, and it's a constant process back and forth. But I also found that that nose down position it's something that I subjectively found I could produce better power in that position. But if I was to go back 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and I've had saddle pressure mapping done at various different bike fitters, and the one thing we always found for me was that by tilting the nose of the saddle up, I got much greater pelvic stability. But in tilting the nose up, I got posterior pelvic tilt, which I found then more difficult to make power, more difficult to get into an aerodynamic position. Fast forward a few years, I've now got myself into a position where I can use the nose down and get the benefits from that. And the thing that I think unlocked that for me was reducing the saddle height, because I think, and this is just a bit of a guess from myself, but I think previously where my saddle height was maybe on the upper limit of what was okay, when I tried to tip the nose of the saddle down, that's where I got the instability from. So I guess the question from all that is, as that trend of going further forward and nose down, like we've seen Pogacar do, like we've seen Remco do, like we've seen so many of the pros do, is that something that has, like you referenced there, center of pressure, is that something that pros have figured a way to utilize that position, utilize the better power from it, and utilize the better aerodynamic position you can adopt, because we also understand now that the ideal comfortable position isn't necessarily what we should be targeting anymore?
I think you have mentioned 3 different groups, and we have to.
It was a very lengthy question. Yeah, sorry about that.
And we have to differentiate between these groups. And this is something. It's not differentiation between pro world and just the hobby world. It's so you see all these 3 groups also in the pro world. And the first group you've mentioned is the group looking for comfort. So they are sensitive, let's assume sensitive soft tissue, and they don't want to have a lot of high pressure, especially in the front part of the saddle. For this group, it doesn't make sense to go up with a saddle nose. It might increase a little bit pelvis stability, but it definitely increases max pressure as well. So they will quite quickly start to compensate for that and to rotate the pelvis posterior with some negative effects to their lumbar spine. So if you're a rider looking for comfort and being sensitive, it doesn't make sense to go up. For them, I would say at least it should be a neutral saddle nose. And then we have got riders looking for more stability. And there I see that especially that package of saddle height and saddle tilt, so nose down, might be a good package to find an individual optimum. I always warn that we go too aggressive with saddle tilt. So if it goes to maybe 5 degrees or even more, we often see a trend that your pelvis shifts forward on the saddle. And then you lose contact to the rear part. But the rear part of the saddle is the part where you can get the most body weight. So it goes more to pubic rami and to ischial tuberosities. And these regions of the pelvis, they are dedicated to take more pressure. If you just move forward, you move forward to the more sensitive areas of the pelvis. And what you also do, you change your whole mechanics by moving forward to the saddle nose. Your knee is also in a different direction. Your shoulder angle might be closer, and you just might shorten the reach. It's not because the bike gets shorter, it's because you get shorter on the bike and you keep the same handlebar position, but you move with the pelvis, and this can be in centimeters. It can be 5 centimeters of a shift. And the reason the change could be going a little bit lower with the saddle, that you might take some stress out of the hamstrings, if that's the reason. And then, but go a little bit up again, that you're coming closer to neutral. I would say in the range 0 to 3 degrees. That's my range where I look for in terms of saddle tilt. If it's more, it's often a sign that saddle tilt doesn't work. And then we've got the third group, and the third group is looking for power transfer and power production. And there's a big if for me. It can work if you tilt the nose, but you have to hold that with your pelvis. If you fill that gap by rotating the pelvis a little bit forward, and by keeping your lumbar spine straight, and you can hold that, so you're able and you're capable with your core muscles to hold that, then it can be a benefit for your power production. If you're not strong enough with your core muscles, or over time, if you're getting fatigued and tired, it might be that then there's a negative effect that you shift forward. So it depends on the individual, but for that group, I can see that opening that gap and rotating a bit forward increases your quad activity and can help to optimize your pushing phase.
Okay, you mentioned 3 different categories that riders might fall into and what they're looking for in a bike fit. The sort of the topic I had discussed recently was choosing to rotate your pelvis further forward and getting some of the benefits that may or may not come with that. Can a rider pick or choose what they want to be? Can you be at the moment looking for more comfort and then be, I don't know, maybe you're enlightened by the Performance Process podcast and you think, I want to tilt my nose down and adopt this position. Is it as simple as choice, or is a rider fixed into the type of bike fit they require?
So you can swap groups, I would say it this way. It depends a little bit on your physical fitness level, especially on your lumbar spine and hamstring flexibility. So for example, if you're super limited there, then it also needs some work that you have to do on your own to increase the ability to rotate forward with your pelvis. Because that's one specific movement we need from the body to, for example, optimize a saddle position for power transfer, or to optimize a saddle position to go a little bit more aerodynamic. You need that ability. We do one test in standing where we measure your sacrum angle. And if you reach, like, say, 40 degrees in standing, we can't expect that you do 20 degree on the bike just because it's out of your range of motion. So if you want to go aerodynamics or power transfer optimization, there's definitely a level of human body adaptation that needs to be done. But then it's also possible to say, hey, I want to create better comfort, better stability, and maybe as an ultimate choice, also optimize my power transfer by having a different saddle position. And I would say, yeah, that's possible. It might take a process and a few sessions to do that, but it's possible to go that way.
It kind of comes back to what Dan Bigham has said, in that you can train the bike fit. You can't more than you can train physiology. Is again paraphrasing him, and Dan, don't shoot me if I've paraphrased you incorrectly, but I think we've got the gist of what he was saying.
I think it's also important here to think about a bike fit as a process rather than one event that never comes back. So it's always that specific moment when you analyze on a certain picture, but it could be that it's a process. You take adaptation into account, then you make a next step and the next step and the next step. So it can definitely be that it takes longer than you would like to.
Bike fitting is still such an individual thing. If you take someone like Tadej Pogacar, and as we demonstrated recently, he has moved his saddle all the way further forward on a frame with a steeper seat angle, and he has moved to an inline seat post versus a previously using a setback seat post. So he is like so much further forward than he used to be. And then on top of that, he's tilted his nose of the saddle down versus where it used to be 3-4 years ago when he first won the Tour de France and he had the nose tilted up. It's a huge change.
Yep.
But compare that to Tom Pidcock, who has the maximum setback seat post option on his bike, and then he's got the saddle slammed all the way back on that. And you're kind of looking at it and going, how can both be right?
Yeah, it's super individual, and it depends on a large number of factors. So, for example, when you look at crank lengths, you might also see that there's a big difference in crank lengths between Pogacar and Tom Pidcock.
Well, I know Tom has been experimenting with, I think, 165 cranks and 160 cranks recently.
Even 160, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not sure exactly which length Pogacar uses. I think it's 170, but I could be wrong on
that. So I think that adjustment of a saddle for raft is a pretty common adjustment that we are also using quite often. Important is to understand what happens, so how the body reacts to that adjustment. And there are two possible scenarios. So let's assume you move the saddle forward. It could be that you have found that sweet spot on the saddle already. Maybe you have used that saddle for the last 2 years. You know exactly the area where you sit on. When you move the saddle forward, your pelvis would move together with the saddle also forward. That would change your whole mechanics. So it would make your position shorter. If you want to do that, you can do it. Maybe because your position was a little bit too long and you want to reduce reach, then you have done that perfect way. But it could also be a second scenario that you move to a different loading area. So your pelvis would basically stay in the same position in relation to the handlebar and to the bottom bracket, but you just move the material, the saddle, underneath you. And that would mean you would change your loading pattern on the saddle and you would move more to the rear part of the saddle. We could see that in pressure mapping because your COP and also your pressure spots would move more backward. And that's often an adjustment for us if we have too much pressure in the front, that we can get rid of that pressure and that we just shift some of the body weight that's applied to the saddle more to the rear part, to the stronger part of the pelvis. But it's important to control. It's not necessarily if you move the saddle forward that you switch to a different location, or if you move to the saddle forward that you always move together with the saddle. We have these two groups and it depends on several factors. The best way is to control if that happens. And we have used that adjustment, for example, with some riders. It was about a year ago when Shimano updated the Dura Ace version. So the new Dura Ace we had at that point of time had a longer lever. So the shifter was a little bit longer. When you mount that for 10 riders, you see that in pressure mapping, 8 out of 10 have their COP a little bit more to the front of the nose. What happened? Their position of the hand were fixed. So the lever moves forward, the hand moves forward, but they have to adjust with their pelvis as a compensation movement because they just didn't feel as strong as before because the shoulder angle changed. And they reacted by also moving their pelvis forward to a smaller loading area, just saddle nose, and it resulted in a lot of saddle discomfort. At that point of time, you can compensate and try to compensate by bringing the saddle a little bit more forward to come back to the previous position on the saddle, which was more stable and more comfortable. So the reason we had to adjust for some riders at that point of time was a different shifter at the cockpit. That's how all these contact points interact.
And then I guess you've got longer shifters, but the same reach on the handlebars, and then the difference between the tops and riding on the hoods is different. You mentioned a couple of different scenarios that may happen when you move the saddle, and the one that I would have thought is the sort of ideal scenario is when you move the saddle underneath the rider themselves stays in the same place, but their position on the saddle changes. Is that what you're looking for? Is that going to give a better COP?
Yep.
Is that what you want to see happens when the saddle actually moves, the rider stays?
Yeah, and that's also the scenario that happens more often. So in some studies, we have seen this is about 70% as a reaction to that adjustment. So you can expect that there is a higher chance that you really find a new loading pattern rather than moving together with the saddle. But in some scenarios, in this 30% rest of the group, we have seen, especially when you're used to that saddle, when you're on that saddle for quite a long time, and you have really found your sweet spot that you want to hold. That's often the reason. You can do whatever you want with the adjustment. You will always see the same pressure pattern. And then we just have to keep in mind, okay, there is a negative effect now to the whole mechanical element of the position because we have changed some angles here and we have reduced reach.
The other thing you mentioned there is crank length. And if we think of that relative to saddle position, we sort of get back to the old way of thinking in terms of when your crank is in the 3 o'clock position, you want your knee to be over the pedal spindle, knee over pedal spindle as it was called. Is that still relevant? Is that still something you're targeting, or are you setting the rider in a position where they've got center pressure in the right region on the saddle and they feel comfortable?
Yeah, so what we have seen over the years is that center of pressure is a way more sensitive parameter than knee over pedal spindle. From time to time, we still draw that line to get an understanding where the knee is, but more thinking about the rough ballpark. It's not that it really has to be exactly on that. There are also some reasons when you put the knee a little bit more in front, or also when you put the knee a little bit more behind the pedal spindle, depending a little bit which muscle structure you also wanted to recruit. But I would say that especially COP on the saddle is way more sensitive and gives you a better idea because that's also, you can gather the whole pedal stroke, and COP is a package of information for the whole pedal stroke for both sides rather than just one moment within a pedal stroke. And nobody really knows if 3 o'clock is really the exact moment where you produce most of your power. We have done some internal tests also with a university. Sometimes you see it's 95 degrees. So not 3 o'clock, maybe up to 3.5 or whatever. Sometimes it's 100 degrees. When we go into aero position, it's way later than it is. It's not at 90 degrees. So I think it's still, it's like an old parameter, a traditional one that's still used by some fitters. We concentrate more on dynamic parameters that gives us a more sensitive picture.
And yeah, I think it's another one of those sort of acid tests where it stemmed from a time where we didn't have the sort of technology we have nowadays, and it was a great starting point. And
Exactly.
At least in my opinion, it's still a great starting point, but we maybe have to delve a bit further with some of the information and understanding that we have these days.
Yeah, and you mentioned crank length. So for example, for me, top dead center, so 12 o'clock is way more important than 3 o'clock when I want to evaluate crank length. And if you want to, I can explain a little bit further.
Please. Yep.
So when we think about the right crank length, the top dead center, so the moment when you go when you have the transition from pulling into pushing phase and you have to go over the 12 o'clock position, that's the moment that's where you get the hardest work for your human body, because it's your hip angle is maximum closed, your foot position is kind of steep, and you have to push forward. And that's often the moment where riders really struggle to keep their position, or to keep the pelvis in the right position, and also to keep the knee in the right position. So we often see a compensation movement of the knee when the transition from pulling to pushing starts. And compensation means the knee kicks out. Okay. And that for me is a typical sign that something's not right. So it's really, it's a hard job for the rider at that point of time to go through the 12 o'clock position and start a new pushing phase. Another compensation movement would be at that point of time, you rotate your pelvis posterior, and then you rotate anterior again. And both compensation speak the same language. You effectively want to increase your hip angle. You're searching for more hip angle, and both compensation movement lead to a bit more hip angle. And sometimes we also see that riders are not doing that when they are fresh, but when they are starting to get fatigued, then the muscle structures really have a hard time to make that specific movement in the pedal stroke. And when we make a test with a shorter crank and really switch to a shorter one, we effectively open up the hip angle a tiny bit. And then we see that way more often these compensation movements are less or are completely gone.
Okay, folks, Ronan here again, just interrupting to say that is where the sample version of this episode ends. So if you're hearing this, it might mean that you're not already a member. So head over to escapecollective.com/join to sign up today, get the rest of this episode, and stop getting interrupted by me in future. And finally, if you are a member and you're hearing this, then get in contact with us or check out the email from when you initially became a member, which will have instructions on how you can access the uninterrupted version of this podcast.